Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, afternoon, or early evening, wherever this event might find you. We're pleased that you're able to join us, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. My name is Gabriel Liza. I work here at FAO, North America, working on partnership and outreach, and it's my honor to give you a few housekeeping details as we start our event this morning. So to begin with, I want to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be shared with you at the conclusion of the event. We really appreciate that you're able to join us. And if you are in social media, in particular Twitter, we'd like for you to help us promote this event and the details that are coming out of the event. The hashtag to use for this particular event is LandscapeRT, hashtag LandscapeRT. So please know that
we can't hear you, Gabe.
Details of our. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. My apologies. My internet went out a little bit. Due to time constraint, we'll not be able to share full bios of our speaker, but I'll be sharing them on your chat box. So please keep an eye on that. Please use the Q&A box to direct any specific questions to any one of our panelists. And if you have any reports or information that you'd like to share about the discussion today, please use the chat box. We thank you very much for joining us this morning, and I'll pass the baton to our colleague, Sara Scherr of EcoAgriculture, who will moderate the event. Thank you very much. Sara, to you.
Maybe we let Vimlendra Sharan begin and start and open this session.
Hi, morning, everyone. I think just before I get into anything else, one housekeeping announcement, which I think Gabe missed out on. Please rename yourselves if you haven't, to give your correct designation and organization. I can see Gabe listed in multiple places. So I think, Irene, you need to rename your screen. The rest of you, I think, have done that. So with that, a very good morning to all of you. Good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining. And I understand that people have joined in from various corners of the world and from various countries, which is indeed one of the positive fallouts of this pandemic, that our roundtables and our seminars, which used to be perhaps limited to 40, 50, 80 people, have now suddenly exploded, and we have people joining in from all parts of the world. But that also has made it very much more interesting, because we get different contexts from which people come, different ideas from different parts of the world. So it's not a very minimal North America sort of a scenario that one discusses. And that is what has really made this interesting. So silver lining to every cloud, that is the most positive fallout for us from this pandemic. We are aware today that nearly 700 odd million people are suffering from chronic hunger. A quarter of our children are stunted under the age of 5, and a third of the global population is malnourished. Obesity, 1 in 8 on the planet. And when we look at these figures at FAO, we understand very clearly that conserving biodiversity and reducing the pressure on natural resources and ecosystem has never been as important as it is today, especially in the context of changing climate and the adverse impact that climatic changes are having on food and agriculture issues and on biodiversity all around the globe. We also understand very well that over the years, designing landscapes to accommodate both human beings and nature has always posed its challenges. Historically, it is posing challenges today, and it will pose challenges in years and decades to come. But it is definite that it has been recognized world over that site-specific approaches, while it addresses an isolated local biodiversity conservation challenge, it's not really capable of looking at the bigger picture, and therefore integrated landscape approach, it becomes all the more important and becomes a basic framework for really going forward. At FAO, and I think Irene will speak more at length at what FAO does, but just to mention that at FAO work on biodiversity aims at supporting countries in balancing the need to improve food and nutrition security and livelihood, and at the same time balancing it with loss of natural resources and loss of biodiversity. And how do we take both the challenges and the uncertainties forward while maintaining and preserving the large biosphere of the reservoir of biological diversity that is needed to support adequate food for everyone in the world. We have multiple bodies in FAO which work on biodiversity. I'll just name three which is most prominent and perhaps known to all of you. The Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and the International Plant Protection Convention. So all these three bodies housed within FAO have done excellent work and are doing excellent work on biodiversity conservation. It is an agenda which is ingrained in the work which FAO does, as is in many other organizations who are working in this sector. We will hear more about the landscape approach to biodiversity conservation post-2020. Now, anyway, 2020 is nearly over. And I'm really happy that we have Midori Paxton from UNDP as our keynote speaker, who will really bring forth some deep insights into this issue. And a big thank you also to all of our panelists, all experts in their own field, perhaps all capable of delivering the keynote at different functions or different webinars later, perhaps with us. So thanks to all five of you for joining us and being a part of it. Thank you to Sara for her hard work and her team's hard work in getting this through. We have FAO and EcoAg has been partners for decades, and we have had multiple webinars and multiple events around this whole landscape issue. And Sara has been the leading light in that. So thank you very much for co-hosting this with us, coordinating this whole show, bringing the speakers, and taking this forward. So let me hand it all back to Sara, the expert in the area, to take all this, to take the conversation forward. So thank you, all of you, and I really look forward to a really engaging dialogue over the next hour and a half. Thank you. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you very much, Vimlendra, and welcome to all of you. It's just delightful to see the wide interest that there is in this topic right now. It's a seminal moment. I'm Sara Scherr. I'm the president and CEO of EcoAgriculture Partners. We have been operating for almost 20 years, specifically to try to look at how to align agricultural development and food security with biodiversity conservation in a very dynamic, positive, and synergistic way. We're a nonprofit, and we work around the world to try to support sustainable landscape strategies that align these elements along with social well-being, health, and other ecosystem services. We're a convener of a new initiative called 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people. And all of this work has always had as one of its central focuses the conservation of biodiversity, not only the biodiversity within agriculture, but wild biodiversity as well. And I wanted to actually add to Vimlendra's comment about what FAO does in biodiversity, because they also have many landscape programs that incorporate wild biodiversity within their strategies and have been a leader in this field. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today first. We're really thrilled to have Midori Paxton with us to provide our keynote address. And after she speaks, we're then going to turn to two of our panelists to talk about, bring us right to the ground. Those of us who are trying to work on biodiversity conservation in production landscapes, what have they learned? What are they doing? What do they want to say to the post-2020 framework for biodiversity conservation? And then we'll switch over to two other of our panelists who will look at the big picture on policy about how the post-2020 framework is what kind of strategies are coming out of that, and how are they integrating landscape management in an operational sense in the work that's going on right now. Then we'll let Midori make any comments she might have on the remarks that have been made by our panelists. And at that point, then we'd really like to have the group respond to you. We obviously have hundreds of participants in this initiative, and we're not going to be able to have a lot of one-on-one conversation, but we do want to encourage you to use the chat function if you have things that you want to say or ask, or maybe keep on people's minds as you move forward. And also, if you are in a position to answer some of the questions or make some comments on other people's chats, we also welcome you to do that. But if you want to make a question specifically to Midori Paxton or to one of the panelists, we encourage you to go to that Q&A box that's next to the chat function and indicate those. And my colleague Tom Dare from EcoAgriculture Partners will pick a few of those for the panelists to respond to as a group. So with that, I'd like to turn to invite Midori Paxton to give our keynote. She has been the head of the United Nations Development Program of their Ecosystem and Biodiversity Program based in New York since 2016. And she is responsible for a very large portfolio of biodiversity projects in more than 130 countries. And of about 300 of those projects, about 150 of them involve biodiversity conservation in production landscapes. And she and her team and colleagues have learned a whole lot over the last decade about how to do this. And I'd like to turn the floor over to Midori. You can see her full bio in the chat. Midori, go ahead.
Do you see the slide? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sara. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I say what a pleasure it is to be here and to see such a large and, I'm sure, distinguished audience. And in this talk, I would like us to look at some of the key levers for upscaling integrated landscape management towards achieving the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Oops, I'm trying to change the slide. Oops, good. Humanity is waging war on nature. This is what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said during the historic State of the Planet speech last week. And he then went further, saying, making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. It must be the top priority for everyone, everywhere. The casualty in this war on biodiversity are almost too large to comprehend. More than 1 million species that or more are projected to go extinct in our lifetime. And the ultimate casualty in this global catastrophe, at least from the human-centric viewpoint, are us, humans. We know that half of the global GDP, at least to some extent, is dependent on nature. And we also know half of the 169 Sustainable Development Goal targets need nature to achieve them, because our lives and well-being essentially depend on nature. Yet we also know that 2 out of 5 hectares of land are already degraded, and land degradation has already trapped 1.3 billion farmers on marginal and ever degrading land, and over 2 billion people are living in areas with high water stress. Every year, we lose 10 million hectares of tropical forest, including many of the big landscape areas, and inching ever closer to irreversible tipping points, both in terms of biodiversity conservation and in terms of climate change. And each year, more potential tipping points appear in the Great Barrier Reef, and the fires in the Amazon, Australia, and as you see, for example, in this picture, this Pantanal on the slide. So there is an urgent need for bringing this war on nature to an end and to recover our future. So the year 2021 will see the finalization of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework towards the vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. If you look at the 2050 goals and target and draft 2030 targets, the need for integrated landscape approach in an effort to achieve the post-2020 framework is a no-brainer. Biodiversity conservation and ecosystem management is about protecting and managing the natural world that is essentially living, functioning systems connected with each other, creating a range of natural phenomena which luckily happen to provide an essential life support system for humans. These primarily helpful biodiversity and ecosystem functions have no jurisdictional or national boundaries. For example, to protect one tiger, we will have to look at 15 square kilometers of landscape. On an even grander scale, to save jaguars, that we have to look at connectivity of the corridor that span 18 countries from Mexico to Argentina. In many countries, the majority of biodiversity occurs outside protected areas, across farmlands and settlement. And people living in the landscape must be at the center of conservation efforts because they are an integral part of the landscape elements. I think I'm told that my slide is not there. Is that correct, Sarah?
It is there.
I see them. Someone did not.
Okay,
But,
great. Maybe it depends on the device.
Says that she does see them now, our guests,
Okay,
so
great.
we're fine.
So what are the ingredients for scaling up integrated landscape approach to conservation? Landscape is a mosaic of different land units and the different land management regimes. And landscape approach to conservation has been talked about and tried for many decades. And there are many landscape actions around the world. But it seems to be, it is still a sort of fringe concern for many. So why hasn't it instead become a norm placed at the center of government policies and strategies and a priority for financing and investment? Conserving mountain habitats for tiger in Malaysia not only protects some of the most biodiverse tropical forests in the world, but ultimately keeps Malaysia and Singapore supplied with fresh water. So why it hasn't taken off? I currently oversee an ecosystem biodiversity portfolio of 300 projects in around 130 countries. And the experience teaches me there are at least 4 key levers to accelerate integrated landscape management as shown in this slide. I hope most of you can see. Policy and institutional coherence, which is the first point on the slide, is probably the most fundamental lever. What is the point of investing in nature conservation if $600 billion per year in agricultural subsidies with no safeguard or consideration for nature will act as a significant perverse incentive to destroy nature? We are essentially paying to conserve while we are paying a lot more to destroy. It's like your left hand and right hands are acting independently and unknowingly and against the body's best interest. Given this tendency towards incoherence, our biodiversity conservation ecosystem management project aimed to establish a unity of purpose. We always include a systemic and institutional capacity strengthening components in our project design, we mainstream biodiversity in land use planning, development and sector policy planning practices, and we bring different sectors together. Line ministries, different levels of government, national, federal, state, district, to realign policies and to agree on common vision and action. In Ecuador, for example, we worked with the Ministry of Environment and Water and the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock to develop a joint guidelines for land use plans that include biodiversity conservation. Also sustainable production and climate resilience criteria to be legislated for all local governments to comply with. To take one more example, in the Altai mountain landscape in Mongolia, which is in this background picture, we supported institution of environment units within local government offices. These units are staffed by people from different departments, land use planning, agriculture department, water management, and so on. Mongolian local governments worked on formulation and implementation of integrated landscape management plans covering the biodiversity-rich landscape inhabited by herders and snow leopard and others. So in translating policy and plans into practice, incentive structure plays a major role. I spent 10 years in Namibia up to 2010. One day, I was watching a news report on TV, and a northern village chief appeared talking about elephants raiding their crops. I thought first, oh no, here we go again. Working under the director of Parks and Wildlife Management at that time, I knew human-wildlife conflict was the biggest headache of the director. But what chief said was totally unexpected. He wanted his community land to be designated as conservation area, essentially. Wildlife for him was a problem, but he had seen conservancies where elephants were an asset. That time, I really felt I'd just witnessed a major breakthrough, the mindset shift of people in rural communities because of the strong incentive they received from the government. And the incentive was the right that was granted in 1995 to sustainably use and benefit from natural resources on their land, which is state land. And the country succeeded in upscaling the multiple use landscape management with 86 conservancies covering 20% of the country, which is more than 3 times larger than the United Kingdom. And the recovery of wildlife numbers and increased community incomes are simply remarkable. And moving next door to South Africa, our landscape management project supported legal work to amend the Income Tax Act. Now, landowners can be deducted from taxable income. So landowners can declare protected areas on their land, and the conservation value of protected areas can be deducted from the income. I mean, the tax, their tax amount. And this scheme essentially made value of nature tangible in the monetary terms to stewards of the conservation areas in the country. And moving away from Africa to a very different landscape, in Bhutan, we supported passage of the access and benefit sharing law with provision for ensuring community benefits from use of genetic resources. And the legislation also recognizes the right of communities to their traditional knowledge associated with the genetic resources, which is a major incentive for communities to conserve their landscape and natural resources. And another essential lever for scaling up is solid multi-sectoral landscape platform models. In the state of Sabah on Borneo, Malaysia, a multi-sectoral stakeholder committee was formed as part of our project to oversee integrated land use management planning of the 260,000 hectare biodiversity-rich primary forest landscape, which links 3 conservation areas. The committee included state government units, different units like Department of Environment, Forestry, Agriculture, Tourism, and local communities, including indigenous peoples, private sector, NGOs, and academia. They worked on the integrated land use management plan for the landscape that presents a clear roadmap for the way forward in the management of conservation, restoration, excuse me, and commercial development areas. This sort of multi-sectoral landscape platform presents a very good model for upscaling integrated landscape management with science-based decision-making mechanisms to secure ecological health of a landscape. And of course, with some good progress, although there are some good progress around the world, it's not all hunky-dory. Sectoral and jurisdictional interests are deeply ingrained in bureaucracy and human nature. Capacity building to bridge different interest groups is essential. We are tackling capacity building by targeting national and local governments and people on the ground, land managers, communities, farmers, industry, scientists, and other role players. This is a must. We support strengthening the institutional capacity of integrated landscape planning and management, including realignment of institutional structure, processes, and staffing structure. And we support integration of spatial planning and the value of nature in the decision-making mechanisms. We provide stakeholders with a range of individual capacity development opportunities. For example, training on use of biodiversity information system, spatial mapping and overlay, could be certification and verification procedures or supply chain business development, and training on wildlife monitoring or regenerative agricultural practices. But it is important to recognize capacity building is a long-term process. It is not something individual projects can complete and say it is all done after 2-3 years, and most of our projects are 5-6 years, but even that length might not be enough. And Namibia's community-based natural resource management program has been going on for the last 25 years. And one success factor, I would say, for its longevity is the existence of community support structure in the country, which provides communities with necessary tools and technical support based on demands from communal conservancies. So recognizing the long-term nature of capacity support for integrated landscape management initiatives, we joined the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative led by the EcoAgriculture Partners and Rainforest Alliance. Through this initiative, we are aiming to build an infrastructure to ensure access to the tools, finance, connections land managers need to achieve holistic, long-term, and ultimately successful management of their landscapes. So in conclusion, the Secretary General said that 2021 is the year of a quantum leap towards addressing the planetary crisis. For this, integrated landscape management must be upscaled to act as a catalyst for ensuring a healthy planet for all of us and fellow inhabitants. The war on nature has to end. It's time to make peace with nature. After all, we are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting our most important ally. Thank you. Back to you, Sara.
Oops. Thank you so much, Midori. That was fascinating and very succinct, and I think gave us 4 very specific ways to move forward in terms of building the post-2020 framework. What I'd like to do now is, first of all, thank everyone who started to share and connect on the chat. And again, encourage you, if you have any specific questions for Midori, to put them in the Q&A. And what I'd like to do now is bring us to the ground and have the 2 of our panelists present to us. The first one being Mike Parr, who's the president of the American Bird Conservancy. He's been with them since 1996, previously worked for BirdLife International, and is a well-known author of a lot of leading books on birds and bird conservation. So we'll have him speak first. And one of the groups that he's been collaborating with is in Guatemala. And we have here Marco Cerezo, who's the general manager and founder of FUNDAECO, who's a development economist like me. And he has been worked with establishing the Forest Action Plan Bureau in Guatemala, the establishment of the Mayan biosphere, and also a creator of the Central American Commission on Environment and Development, we call the CCAD. In 1990, Marco created FUNDAECO in Guatemala and has led the organization for 30 years. You can find more about him in the bio in the chat. But what I'd like to do is start by having Mike present and then followed by Marco. They'll just speak for about 4 or 5 minutes, and Marco will have a little more to show you some slides about what they're actually doing in Guatemala. So Mike, why don't you proceed?
Great. Yes. Thank you, Sara. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around the world. Thanks to EcoAgriculture Partners and to FAO for inviting me to participate today. I'm delighted to be here. Really appreciated the keynote from Midori. And I'd like to echo a number of the points that Midori made there. And also, it's a great opportunity to see and participate with Marco. It's been a great colleague, and it's going to be very interesting to hear from him about the work that FUNDAECO is doing in the conservation coast of Guatemala. I'd like to just make a few comments. Biodiversity conservation has traditionally been thought of as kind of a protected areas approach. Protected areas are probably one of the great contributions that the conservation community has made to biodiversity around the world. But as a bird conservationist, I recognize that protected areas alone will not be sufficient to conserve birds around the world. And last year, the bird community in North America released new science showing that we've lost approximately 3 billion birds in one lifetime since 1970 in North America alone. And those birds cannot be protected by protected areas. They spread out across large landscapes. Most of them nest in the north and move south in the winter. Mostly insect-eating birds need to move south either to the tropics or to the southern part of North America. So those birds need very large landscapes, and you can't protect them from protected areas alone. So what is the solution to this problem? We all know that biodiversity is in a crisis globally. We all know that there's this undeclared war on nature going on, and we continue to try to fix it. But we're struggling. So what are we actually going to do to really fix this relationship we have with nature, recognizing that agricultural systems and landscapes are critical to wild biodiversity as well as cultivated biodiversity? And I think I'd just like to focus on a couple of critical issues, and I think Marco will amplify these as well. And I'd like to go back to some of the things and really amplify some of the things that Midori said. Looking at the HE targets from CBD, target 3 relates to incentives. And a lot of communities around the world would love to be able to have a better relationship with nature and biodiversity, but are struggling. They need to feed their communities. That's got to be their first priority. So, where is the capacity to make that change? And I think that we need to look to the private sector. We need to look to policymakers and governments and international institutions. How can we help communities create this relationship with nature that's improved? And I think incentives are going to be one of the most critical aspects of that. And there are some really great examples. Midori mentioned some from Namibia, but there are many great examples of how these types of incentives are working very effectively right now to help farmers and the agricultural sector interact better with biodiversity. One of the critical aspects of it, I believe, is that incentives need to be tied to biodiversity outcomes. And that is something that hasn't really happened at the scale that we need yet. Midori mentioned agricultural subsidies and this issue of one hand working against the other. We need to tie agricultural subsidies to biodiversity conservation outcomes. And that's happening. There's plenty of great examples of this. If you look here in the United States, under the US Farm Bill, the Natural Resources Conservation Service has a number of great programs. One is called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and it targets specific bird species such as the golden-winged warbler, long-billed curlew, and others, which would be enhanced by incentives to private landowners from the US government to help manage for those species. It's an incredibly effective program. There's a tremendous program in Costa Rica, which my friend Carlos Manuel Rodriguez has been critical in setting up, on payments for ecosystem services. Again, tied around some of these birds like the golden-winged warbler, which migrates from North America to Costa Rica, providing incentives to landowners tied to biodiversity outcomes. So these types of incentives, which connect to nature and biodiversity, can be incredibly successful and effective in delivering biodiversity outcomes. And you're going to hear from Marco about how some of these are working in ranching, in agroforestry and forestry systems. Tremendously exciting opportunities there. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. I'd just like to say thank you again to FAO. I'd be happy to take some questions. American Bird Conservancy definitely welcomes the participation with other groups. And I'd love to hear any questions in the chat. We're working on what we call birdscapes around the Americas. And I think I'll turn it over to Marco, who will go into a little bit more detail about how this actually is played out on the ground with some of the incentives we're working on. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over, I guess, back to Sara to introduce Marco. Thank you.
I will pass it right over to Marco. Go ahead, and looking forward to your follow-up.
I will be sharing a short presentation with you today, and I'm going to be talking about the Conservation Coast, which is the landscape of Caribbean Guatemala. We have actually trademarked this name, the Conservation Coast, that refers to 25 years of trying to build a sustainable landscape across Caribbean Guatemala. Very rapidly, some of you might know this region, high biodiversity, high endemism, but also high deforestation, these rare and endemic amphibians and trees and insects, and of course, flagship species like the jaguar are being threatened by accelerated deforestation across the region. So for the past 25 years, we have tried to conserve biodiversity. And our first approach was, of course, to create protected areas. And from a traditional perspective, we have 30% of the landscape in protected areas. That's enough, job is done. Of course, we know that's not true. Biodiversity moves, flies with the air, with the currents. And what we want to do is build a landscape where a bird coming from Washington, D.C. on her way to Colombia may go from a protected forestry to an agroforestry plantation, to a forest plantation, to a riparian habitat, to another protected area, and on to the south towards Colombia. So really, from this perspective, the traditional perspective of protected areas, we move to try to build a sustainable landscape. And of course, first of all, we came with core zones for protected areas. We then started creating nature reserves through targeted land acquisitions in high priority habitats, but that wasn't enough. So the next step was to build a REDD+ project. We have about 55,000 hectares of forest out of the 100,000 hectares of forest that we want to include in the REDD+ project. Of course, then we started working on multi-strata agroforestry and tree plantations. We've used cardamom under trees, cocoa under trees, coffee under trees, and other trees, rubber, timber, staple trees, fruit trees, to create in communities sustainable agriculture and around that natural forest uses that create livelihoods, create revenues, but also that create permanent forest cover. We've also looked at the ocean and the seas and the rivers, and we're trying to create a network of no-take fish restoration zones. We're at 17,000 hectares, 17,000 plus hectares of no-take restoration zones. Why? Because we also need sustainable artisanal fisheries for food security. And we have been moving towards coastal and riparian forest conservation, over 20 kilometers of protected and pristine shores. We want to get to 100 kilometers of protected, pristine shores. We are creating urban green belts in the main cities across the region also, but we need to do more. And some of the things we haven't done is, for instance, silvopastoral systems. The main driver of deforestation has been cattle ranching, and now we need to look at building silvopastoral systems across 100,000 hectares of cattle pastures, restore wetlands, and of course, work with the agro-industrial plantations to move them towards certification and biodiversity-friendly practices. So again, moving from a traditional protected area perspective to create a sustainable landscape from border to border, so that a bird moving again from Washington to Colombia will move through protected and sustainable landscapes. Of course, this effort has taken dozens of institutions, donors, hundreds of communities collaborating. We've used grants, we've used public incentives for forest protection and restoration. The Probosque program in Guatemala has been going on for more than 20 years, and it's a very successful public investment payment for forest protection and restoration. And during the COVID pandemic, actually, forest protections incentives have been a key income for poor communities in the region. We've used impact investments. We work closely with the Althelia Climate Fund, now Mirova Natural Capital, and also with the Livelihood Fund. Althelia supported us with a large REDD+ project, and of course, Livelihood Funds helped us to create more than 2,000 hectares of agroforestry plantations. We've sold verified carbon units under the Vera VCS CCD standards. Over 4 million certified carbon units have been sold to the voluntary market to fund these efforts, these conservation efforts across the landscape. We've used loans from local development banks, and hopefully over the first quarter of next year, we'll do the first issuance of the Conservation Coast Green Bonds, which is going to be the first emission of green bonds by an NGO. And hopefully we'll do that with an investment firm from Europe. And again, so blended finance is very important. Of course, territorial governance is key. We've legalized over 15,000 hectares of community lands. We cannot move to sustainable agriculture and tree planting if communities do not have full legal security of their land. We've created different participatory means of protected area management, work with regional councils, FIC processes, and one key issue is we have had an active role in law enforcement and strategic litigation, because sustainable landscapes are also, and sometimes very importantly, about governance. What would have helped over the past 2 decades? Well, first of all, public-private people initiatives are the only way forward. We must transit toward a collaborative mentality and move away from a competitive or command and control mentality. We will not be able to build sustainable landscapes if we don't move toward this collaborative collective intelligence. Then from active opposition to active support from protected area agencies. 10 years ago, 7 years ago, we all had active opposition to sustainable landscape strategies. Why do you want to plant rubber trees and cardamom outside a protected area? Some conservation biologists thought this was heresy, and they didn't understand migratory birds love these secondary forests, love these forest plantations as they move across the landscape. Jaguars are generalists that move across agricultural fields if we don't hunt them. We also need to scale up financing and go beyond pilots. This is key, and for this we need the active support from governments to mobilize private investments. Of course, regulatory and REDD+ nesting frameworks must be aligned to support the mobilization of investments. We sometimes have oppositions and lack of articulation that make it difficult for private investors to deploy their investments in sustainable landscapes. And finally, governance and law enforcement are vital to achieve cumulative results. We are facing the hemispheric drug trade. We are facing, illegal land occupations. We are facing difficult situations in the territories, and investing in governance and law enforcement is vital for sustainable landscapes. So the idea is that we will have a legacy for future generations. There's also a social component. We have a network of women clinics across the landscape, over 25 women clinics that ensure access to family planning and sexual and reproductive health to young girls, because we also need a social landscape that is sustainable. We need training, as Midori said, and over the biophysical components of a sustainable landscape, we also need the social components, including empowered rural girls and women, to create a large sustainable landscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marco. I had heard about this initiative, but I've never been there, and now I really am inspired to go, and I hope you'll be able to join us in the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative. I really appreciated your moving from the range of activities that you needed to do to have border-to-border landscape that would support biodiversity and also support the people in it to have thriving livelihoods. And I appreciated your specific suggestions for things that need to be in the elements of the post-2020 framework for biodiversity conservation. And so what I'd like to do now is move to our next two panelists who are very actively involved in moving these negotiations, these global multi-country negotiations forward, to come up with a strategy that will support and guide the work that's being done within the countries. The first person I'd like to have speak is Jyoti Mathur-Filipp, who is the director of the Implementation and Support Division at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity that's leading this effort. And she's leading the work on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So if there's any advice you'd like to give to her, this is your chance in the chat, all of you out there, and also, of course, the panelists. And the other person who's going to be speaking with us is Irene Hoffmann, who is Secretary of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. She's also been chief of the Animal Genetic Resources Branch and Animal Production, and been the secretary of the Intergovernmental Technical Working Group on Animal Genetic Resources. And she's going to take a look at what these negotiations look like and some of the ideas that are coming forward for the post-2020 framework from an agriculture perspective. So let me start first with Jyoti. Why don't you move ahead, go right ahead.
Thanks so much, Sara. It's very, very difficult to come after such a concrete example as the Conservation Coast, and I hope we can scale it up to the whole globe if it's at all possible, because these kind of examples are so necessary for us to move our own agenda and the work of biodiversity forward. And anything Costa Rica does is always fantastic, so we should just take it and put it all over the world. Let me also thank Midori for presenting us the current trends of biodiversity loss and for highlighting the role of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which we hope will address the negative trends. As Midori said, this is a 30-year framework. It's going to bring us to 2050 and our vision of living in harmony with nature. There are so many different pathways to reach there, but at least for the next 10 years, we're hoping that we will have a set of targets and 2030 targets and milestones that will assess our progress towards the 2050 living in harmony with nature. So there are four messages, key messages from our side. First, biodiversity is key for agriculture. Biodiversity for food and agriculture is indispensable to food security and sustainable development. This is key, and we we must make sure that vital ecosystem services are maintained, that we create them, that we have healthy soils, we pollinating plants, and how we control pests. Biodiversity makes production systems and livelihoods more resilient to shocks and stresses, including those caused by climate change, another huge issue that we will have to grapple with in the coming decades, and especially in 2030 to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to tackle both climate change and nature loss. Otherwise, as Midori said, a huge number of our goals will not be met. It is also, agriculture is also key for, to increase food production with biodiversity and limiting the negative impacts on environment. It's important for us to be looking at all the things that all of you have been talking about: incentives, mainstreaming, blended finance. All of that is needed to ensure that biodiversity and agriculture work well together in the future. Second, a landscapes initiative can be effective to conserve biodiversity. We need to encourage production systems that support biodiversity and harness its power. There are many different biodiversity-based farming techniques. We've heard this from all of you. We have, agroforestry, agroecology, conservation agriculture, and silvopasture that can all work at the landscape level and that can generate productive partnerships to ensure.
I didn't hear anything you said.
She feels a little warm, I think. I'm gonna take that.
Okay, you can hear me? Yes, okay. We have to ensure that biodiversity-based production systems have the capacity to produce food and secure livelihoods while they minimize the cost to the environment. So that brings me to the third very important message from us. The role of agriculture in post-2020 global biodiversity framework will be critical. It will be important for the future of biodiversity, to look at how we manage biodiversity and our agricultural systems. So the international community, as you have heard, is now developing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which will be adopted in Kunming in China next year at COP15. We are still not sure when COP15 will be, but it will happen next year sometime. The new framework is not only going to be addressing the challenges to conserve biodiversity by reducing the drivers of its loss, which Midori put in very, very good perspective in her address, but also the opportunity to enhance the use of biodiversity in the design or redesign of our agricultural and food systems. We are going to have specific targets, if adopted, on mainstreaming, which include productive sectors, and on negative incentives. As was said today, $600 billion per year go on perverse incentives to biodiversity, and those have to, and we've been saying this, I think, for the last 30 years, but we have to somehow find ways in which we move away from these incentives and use the same money towards positive biodiversity outputs. To set us on this transformative path, we also launched the Global Biodiversity Outlook in September, which looks to the future and outlines a number of interdependent transitions that can collectively move our societies into a more sustainable coexistence with nature. Let me highlight only 2 transitions. We have 8, but I will only highlight 2 that are pertinent to us today. The sustainable agriculture transition. This looks at redesigning agricultural systems through agroecological and other innovative approaches to enhance productivity while minimizing negative impacts on biodiversity. This transition recognizes the role of biodiversity, including pollinators, pests, and disease control organisms, soil biodiversity and genetic biodiversity, as well as diversity in the landscape for productive and resilient agriculture that makes efficient use of land, water, and other resources. And the second transition is a sustainable food systems transition. This will enable us to have sustainable and healthy diets with a greater emphasis on diversity of foods, mostly plant-based, and more moderate consumption of meat and fish, as well as a dramatic cut in the waste involved in food supply and consumption. Food waste is a huge problem that we need to get, we need to grapple with. This transition also recognizes the potential nutritional benefits from diverse foods and food systems, and the need to reduce demand-driven pressures globally while ensuring food security in all its dimensions. Finally, for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, it is also an opportunity to bring together actors, stakeholders, rights holders, and address these challenges together. Our framework is a framework for all. It is not just for the CBD parties, it is for everyone. And we have, the parties are purposely developing this framework for all. And we will have a separate set of decisions in the CBD, which will operationalize it for the CBD parties. But we want everyone to be involved in implementing whatever framework is decided in Kunming next year. And the power of individual citizens should not be underestimated. This is the one thing that has changed for us in 30 years. This was not there 30 years ago when we all started doing this work together. Informed citizens can make better decisions. They can apply pressure on their political systems. We strengthen the buyers and consumers' perspectives on biodiversity by raising awareness on the impacts of different products, as well as the importance of biodiversity for food security and healthy diets. And we can shift incentives in the right direction and away from harmful consumption patterns. And of course, we cannot underestimate the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in preserving local biodiversity. And this has been recognized worldwide. They play an extremely important role, and they will continue to play a role in transforming our food systems. Now, before I end, I have 2 points. One is that biodiversity underpins essential ecosystem services all over the world. And this is something that we have, that each one of the panelists and Midori have already highlighted. And finally, the total economic gains to society from transforming the food and land systems have been estimated to have the potential to reach $5.7 trillion a year by 2030. So we should think about this while we are making decisions for our future. I thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jyoti. That is really insightful and gives us more food for thought for the post-2020 framework. I'd like to move it now over to Irene, who will dive a little deeper into the agriculture issues that you have just raised in your remarks.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting, and also thanking all the previous speakers. I hope I don't repeat, but reiterate and strengthen the messages that some of you have made. I think for the agricultural sector, the most important, let's say, recognition in the context of the discussions in the post-2020 have been based on the findings that the past UN decade on biodiversity saw that biodiversity management and conservation absolutely need to be integrated into production landscapes and seascapes. And therefore that the producers as well as the consumers have to be involved in the development, but even more critically in the implementation of the framework. And I think there has been more recognition within the environment community of the potential positive contribution of agricultural sectors to in FAO, we developed the SDG 241 indicator and the sub-indicator on biodiversity. Therefore, ask whether a farm leaves at least 10% of the holding area for natural or diverse vegetation. And we note that this is an indicator that is proposed in the monitoring framework for post-2020. And at farm level, this is already making a big step forward. I've been asked to look a little bit at the implementation of integrated landscape management approaches, but I will not go in the hundreds of FAO projects that we are having in partnerships with many organizations also present in this meeting. But I would like to link some of the relevant findings and gaps that FAO found, and then draw some conclusions. So last year, FAO launched the State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture, developed under the guidance of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. The Commissions considered this report to be a valuable contribution to the discussions on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And it stresses these positive messages from the agricultural sector and supports the findings of that was later confirmed by the IPBES report of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. The report highlighted that the biodiversity and the ecosystems needed for food and agriculture production, thereby for food security, are in fact declining in most countries. And one of the main causes is changes in land and sea use. On the positive side, 80% of the 91 countries that reported for this report said there is an overall increase in the adoption of management practices that can be considered biodiversity friendly. But of course, they stressed there's more improvement needed. We had clustered these approaches, and some of you had mentioned some of them already, into those that cut across production system, ecosystem, landscape, and seascape approaches, and restoration, which also cuts across, falls into that. And then we have a range of practices that are applied within production systems, and there are different production practices, but also diversification of production within the system. And countries came up with gaps that may be important for the future, also policy discussion on the development and implementation of ecosystems approaches. And I call it ecosystem approaches because for the aquatic sectors, integrated land management is very terrestrial, whereas on also in fisheries and aquaculture, we have ecosystems approaches. So many of these biodiversity focused practices and approaches overall can be knowledge intensive, context specific, and they provide benefits only in the relatively long term. And as some of you said, that poses issues with regard to their economic valuation. Several countries reported that there is a lack both of data on the characteristics of their national ecosystems, but also limited understanding of ecosystem function and services. And these two pose major constraints to the development and adoption of ecosystem approaches. Some countries also suggested that the multiplicity of confusing terminology, including in the field integrated landscape management, needs to be harmonized. And that is probably an issue for many of the terms we are using. Several developing countries indicated that information on the application of ecosystems approaches does not reach producers in a practical way. And that therefore there are challenges in scaling up such practices and the need to promote them through integrated packages of capacity development and strengthening policy frameworks and tenure systems and so on. Among the countries that had already developed ecosystem approaches, they mention that often there is little evidence as to how successful these approaches are really in practice, how they affect the supply of ecosystem services, and how they compare to more conventional approaches. And there was a strong request of more research in this area. Lastly, measuring success in ecosystem approaches also remains a challenge. Some countries noted there's a need for baseline surveys, indicators, and monitoring systems that would allow impacts to be evaluated. And these are also critical for the development of payment for ecosystem service schemes. So now negotiations are ongoing between countries to develop a policy response to this State of the World report, which may become a global plan of action on biodiversity for food and agriculture. The Commission had requested that this follow-up global plan of action should contribute to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and also highlight partnerships for areas for partnerships with multiple stakeholders. There you see that this multiple stakeholder aspect comes. And there are several priority areas in this draft text that address integrated landscape, integrated approaches, and multi-stakeholder approaches. Lastly, related to mainstreaming, I would also say that FAO has developed strategy on mainstreaming biodiversity across agricultural sectors.
Thank you so much. That's terrific, Irene. What I'd love to do now is take a few questions from our group first. And Midori, I will invite you, after Tom has read out those 3 questions, for you to also, when you speak, I'll call on you first to respond to anything you wanted to comment on from the panelists as well. Tom, are you ready for that yet?
Yeah, we're ready.
All right,
so,
go right ahead and write these down, everyone. He's going to give you all 3 questions now, and you can pick which ones you'd like to respond to in just 2 minutes each. Midori gets a couple more minutes than that, but the rest of you just get 2 minutes. Go, and there's brilliant questions and comments in the chat. If you haven't been reading, I really encourage all of you to take a look at this chat, and we are taking it very seriously, and we're going to publish it as part of our, a little bit cleaned up, but we'll publish it as part of our outputs from this project. So Tom, go ahead. What are the 3 questions that you're picking out of the many wonderful ones?
Yeah, thanks to all the speakers and panelists today for the excellent discussion, and to all the participants who have been submitting questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Regrettably, we won't be able to go through all of them, like Sara said, but a few that have stood out to me. A question from Flavio Linares, and this has come up multiple times too, is the question of land tenure issues. Land tenure being very important to empowering and ensuring that we have legitimate participation of women, children, indigenous peoples, and other vulnerable groups. And so if the speakers could talk a little bit more about how integrating land tenure issues into ILM and landscape approaches has been demonstrated in the work that they have done, and how it can be better bolstered, would be great. We have a few tangential questions, one from Luke Smith and another one from Aparna Siddhar on monitoring evaluation systems, and how do we get monitoring and accountability systems integrated into large landscape systems, given that they are critical to evaluating the overall effectiveness of them and demonstrating how we make progress forward. Luke Smith has commented that to scale regenerative agricultural solutions, we need accessible verification systems that benefit local communities. So how can we equitably scale verification of both ecological and social outcomes in agricultural systems? And then we also have a question from Valerie Nelson and also from Sara Nama-Rembe, asking more about incentives, because we've had a lot of great comments from the panelists on the use of incentive systems. In particular, there was a question for Marco on how the green bonds program he has been implementing has been utilized and how effective it has been. And there's also been questions about incentives for things like payment for ecosystem services and how those are being utilized. So a lot of great questions. Please do continue to use the chat and the Q&A, and we will record these in follow-up communications. So I'll turn it back to you, Sara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So panelists and Midori, Midori, I'd like to come back to you first to do any comments that you might have or reflections on the contributions of the panelists. And also if there's one or two of those questions that Tom just raised that you'd be particularly interested to comment on. And you'll have about 5 minutes for that. The others I'll give 2. Go ahead, Midori.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sara. Yeah, firstly, on some of the contributions from the panelists, on Michael's point, for example, I fully agree that, you know, landscape management in all points of the great migratory path of the migratory birds is so important. And I would say even, you know, migratory birds population could be an indicator for landscape health transnationally and even intercontinentally. And I just wanted to mention a couple of projects we have on this, which is one of which is dealing with migratory soaring bird in the Rift Valley Red Sea Flyway. And we are working with different sectors, agriculture and power, electricity sector, and of course dealing with hunting and waste management sector to really mainstream biodiversity, and in particular in this case migratory birds and flyway into their system, and working very much closely with BirdLife International, which you might know that this work is going on. And also we are working with China on the safeguarding the protected area, coastal protected area and surrounding areas across the Eastern Flyway, you know, the migratory path from Siberia up to Australia. So that's definitely something which also to do with the integrated landscape management. And I think Marco and also Michael talked about, you know, how we can upscale financing. And there, I think, you know, there are lots of great examples Marco talked about, and that's really encouraging that it's happening. And I think Michael also talked about how we can make those financing performance-based. And there are lots of work I think we are all trying, you know, how impact investment obviously tied to the performance and how we measure that. And we have tried that with also Rhino Impact Bond in Kenya and South Africa. But when we talk about, I think, scaling up financing, I think we have to really look also at domestic financing. I'm talking about public financing. And as we mentioned before, you know, one sector of government, one section of government is investing in something, and then another section is investing in totally different counteractive actions. So we engage with 35 countries under the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, working directly with Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Development Planning to really look at how they're allocating their budget from the perspective of ensuring the biodiversity conservation in the country. And when I talk about biodiversity, of course, I'm talking about ecosystem management. It's about water and it's about food and everything else we need immediately. And looking at how the investment of public finance can be realigned so that we repurpose, you know, the negative financial investment to something positive, and also enhance one part of the allocation, as well as looking at the new way of generating sustainable income, which could be some kind of levy or fund, all sorts of different modalities, and bond as well. And
just one more minute, Midori, okay?
Oh, sorry. Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework it's, as everybody knows, it's delayed, and now next year, which I think is a blessing, with a bit more time for discussion and consideration, including the clear understanding of the impact which we are seeing now around the world of zoonotic diseases like COVID on the world's societies and economies. And I'm sure you people here all know that that's very much to do with disturbed environment and nature. And thank you, Irene, for also sharing those feedback from countries. I think it's really useful and in looking at what's necessary to upscale landscape management. And on the questions, yes, land tenure is definitely critical. But I guess we need to look at that issue in the context of landscape management in different locations, because different countries and location have totally different contexts. For example, Papua New Guinea, most of land is owned by the people on the ground, so customary land rights. And so how we might support landscape management there might be different from Namibia, which is basically they don't own land, but as I mentioned, they are given right to utilize and benefit from the resources on the land. So that doesn't necessarily have to come with the ownership per se, but because of the ownership over natural resources, the sense of ownership really emerged, therefore good stewardship. I think I'm running out of time. I think M&E, I'm sure Irene and others
we'll let some of the others respond to some of the other questions. That was great, Midori. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn to the other of you, and I'm going to be very strict on time. I'll let you know when you have 30 seconds left, because we unfortunately have to stop this amazing conversation in just a few minutes. So let me actually start with Mike. Mike, want to pick one or two of those questions, which were about land tenure, about M&E and monitoring, and about finance. Any comments?
Sure, yes. Thank you. Actually, I just want to say something very quickly about all three. I'm going to keep it brief. In terms of monitoring, obviously I would say this, but birds are a great biodiversity monitor. For example, in Western Europe, birds like the skylark, which has declined considerably, but it's got a very distinctive song. You can get out and you can hear whether the skylark's present or not. It's a really easy and cost-effective way to monitor the health of the environment. Birds are the canary in the coal mine. So I would suggest that that would be one great measure that we could look at using. There are others, but birds are a terrific one. In terms of the incentives, I think mobilizing private sector finance is really kind of the big area for us right now. That's something ABC is very engaged in. Impact investing is growing, but there's a gap between impact investing and biodiversity outcomes. And there are a lot of great pilots out there, but getting pilots to scale is the question, getting pilots investment ready. And I think we need to see more investment from the private sector in moving those biodiversity pilots from that pilot stage to something that can be a full-blown private sector investment project. And we'd like to see the banks and others start to help move those through the pipeline. And also on the agricultural subsidies, I mean, we see Europe and North America, tremendous amounts of money going into the agricultural sector, but the rest of the world doesn't have the same resources. How can we connect those to get biodiversity outcomes? I think that would be worth looking at. In terms of land tenure, of course, it's really critical that people on the land have both the responsibility and the rights to that land. And we work at ABC, we work a lot with ejidos, with indigenous communities, doing a lot of land titling and things of that nature. But it's critical that local ownership of landscape management and planning is factored into all of these biodiversity outcomes. So those are the thoughts that I have in relation to those questions. I'll try and leave it there, and hopefully I can yield my remaining seconds to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very succinct but powerful comments on that. Let me move then to Marco. Pick one or two of those questions and give us your thoughts.
Well, I think that to respond to the questions regarding green bonds and other financial mechanisms, the key here is to build sustainable landscape business models. In FUNDAECO, we have tried to add up income from ecotourism, income from carbon credits, income from forest protection incentives, income from agroforestry, to create a sustainable business model for the whole landscape. And I think that if you are able to do that, then you will be able to create different financial mechanisms such as green bonds or access development banking finance. So that's the key. We can also add biodiversity incentives, water income, and other potential revenues from environmental services that we need to monetize to create a business model. The second thing, which is in the hands of the developed world, is market recognition. You know, a carbon credit from a huge hydro dam is not the same thing as a gourmet carbon credit from a community that's producing cocoa under shadow and protecting jaguars. So the problem we have now is those two carbon credits are treated almost equally. And we need to create ways in which the market, the investors, the MRV systems recognize the market value of high value sustainable landscapes, carbon credits, and other items.
Thank you very much. Irene, let me turn to you. Any thoughts on those three questions about tenure, M&E, or sorry, some of the finance issues?
Yes, thank you. Let me start with M&E. I fully agree that birds, and in other areas also butterflies, are very powerful indicators, and they have the additional advantage that their monitoring is very strongly based on citizen science, and therefore, let's say, maybe a bit more resilient. But the challenge is how to allow local flexibility in a global monitoring framework, where at the end all countries have to agree that one bird here is the same as one bird there, or how, that's the same question as was asked on the carbon credits. So how do we, which level of flexibility do we allow? And I would say flexibility is a lot needed on these indicators. Then on land tenure, I can only confirm it's very important, because without secure tenure, people cannot manage the environment. Just the FAO has guidelines on the responsible management of tenure, which is not only on land, but also for fisheries and forestry. And only if you have secure tenure, you can apply incentives. Otherwise, the common property problems will prevail. And in many countries, securing tenure to natural resources is an ongoing legal and regulatory struggle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Let me move then on to Jyoti. If you could just spend 2 minutes and pick one or two of those questions you'd like to comment on.
Thanks a lot, Sara. First of all, I wanted to apologize to Marco, slip of the tongue. I said Costa Rica instead of Guatemala. I meant Guatemala. So apologies for that. I also wanted to thank you for providing a little bit of a background on the green bond, because rate of return is always, you know, a problem with bonds. And you gave a very good example of how a business model could be, you know, developed around it. Quickly on all three questions, all three of them, land tenure, monitoring, and incentives, are indeed going to be part of the 2030 targets. And again, they have been part of the last targets. They've been part, I mean, the Aichi targets, they were there before. They've always been part of how we need to transform where we want to go. But I think this time the difference is that there's a lot of awareness. I think the whole debate reaching up to the Paris Agreement and in 2015 raised a lot of awareness amongst citizens, amongst all kinds of stakeholders, that there is a need for change and transformation. And maybe that is how we can, in the future up to 2050, actually manage to make changes in land tenure issues and in incentives. Regarding monitoring, I have one very specific point, and that is for this time in in our post-2020 framework, we will have a monitoring framework which will accompany it, and it will have a set of headline indicators which are not developed by us but that already exist, and we're just pulling from other organizations because we don't have to do everything. As I said, it's a framework for all, so we need to involve other people's indicators, and we will only request indicators to be developed where we see gaps. So I think an accompanying monitoring framework with the post-2020 may help again in transforming and helping us implement and meet the targets of the framework and therefore the goals by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're looking forward to seeing all of these things also embrace helping the countries work on how they can report on landscape-wide experiences like the one that Marcos was describing. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, ask you all to join me, unfortunately silently, with a big round of applause for our incredible keynote speaker, Midori Paxton, for our panelists, Marcos Cerezo, Mike Parr, Jyoti, Mathur-Filipp, and Irene Hoffmann. Big yay. Thank you. I'd also like to thank some of the folks who helped here very much behind the scenes, particularly Gabe Laser, Tom Durr, Seth Seamus from EcoAgriculture Partners, but in addition to Gabe, also James Cordero, who helped us with all the technology, and Afi with our outreach, as well as Manon Koningstein, my EcoAgriculture partner, colleague who was working on outreach. And of course, very much to thank FAO for collaborating with us on this wonderful series of events. I do want to remind you all that within the next week or two, you will be receiving a packet of the outputs from this event, and they will include a report, a summary report. They'll include the recording of the whole video presentation. They'll include copies of the PowerPoints that Midori and Marco provided, and they will include an edited version of the chat. So we look forward to having you share those. We hope you'll pass this information also on through social media and to your own networks, and get this conversation rolling. Kunming may not have a specific date yet, but we've been really learning how to be effective in this pandemic with our remote communication. So there's no reason for a pause in these very vibrant and important discussions about biodiversity. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Vimlendra for a final goodbye. Vimlendra Sharan from FAO North America office, our co-host for this event.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you, all the panelists and our keynote speaker, Midori, for sparing your valuable time and being with us. Fantastic conversation, and it's always been a challenge for me to really balance how much we allow you to talk and when do we, end the session, because with these webinars, we really found that 90-minute was the ultimate, is the sweet spot, and anything beyond 90 really sees the audience dropping off. So we try and stick to this 90-minute, which I understand fully well really cuts into some very rich conversation. And at times I feel that, it's so unfair to butt in and say that, okay, your time is up, or you have only 30 seconds to such important issues as we have discussed today. It's really fantastic to hear from all of you, and the takeaways are many, and I'm sure the report will cover all of that. But it was really nice the way, for me, the way, Midori, you started the whole presentation about, making peace with nature. It's important for us to understand that human beings have to live in harmony with nature. They did. We have, over the past century or more, really spoiled it all, as you rightly said, by first paying to destroy and then paying to conserve. So that model needs to change. And change in mindset, incentives linked to biodiversity conservation outcomes, the need for collaboration, the need for multiple financing models, the need to make biodiversity conservation so central to food systems and food security, tenure, monitoring, evaluation. All these are absolutely important. And it's really encouraging to find a growing level of awareness in national governments around the world on these issues. I will not say that we have reached the point where we can really sit back and say that, yes, we have succeeded in our endeavor, but I think we are getting there. It will take a couple of decades, perhaps, maybe 10 years, maybe 20. I don't know, but I see a positive trend, and that is really, really encouraging. So you were the ones who have the baton. You are the ones who are really leading the charge. So congratulations to all of you for the work that you're doing. And thank you once again for making time to be with us and share your thoughts. And a big, big thank you to 300 plus participants who actually joined in today. Normally you have a, from the registrants to participants, there's a drop of about 50%, but that did not happen today. So we had a fairly good participation from all around the world. And thank you everyone for joining. For some of you, it was a very odd hour of the day, but you still joined in. So thanks once again. Thank you, Sara, and thank you to the whole team behind the show from EcoAgriculture Partners and from FAO office in North America, and from FAO in Rome. So thank you all very much, and really hope to catch up with all of you in the future.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye,
Midori.
Midori.
Bye. Bye.
Take care.
Sara,
Bye, everyone.
thank
Look
you.
forward to following
Bye,
up with all of
everyone.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.